Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be another episode of Foul Play Friday, and today we will be talking about the disappearance of Kiplyn Davis. Now, the reason I chose to do this story is because Kiplyn went missing from Spanish Fork, Utah, which is kind of my hometown. I didn't grow up there, but I did live there when I was in college. My grandparents were from there, my parents were from there. So when Kiplyn went missing, I was very aware. Even though I was younger, there were signs with her picture taped everywhere, and the town really rallied together to find Kiplyn. So this has always been a story that has been intriguing to me. I had a request to do more like tapping or scratching, or to add more ASMR triggers to my videos when I do the Foul Play Fridays. So I'm just going to be doing like some tapping and scratching as I tell you the story, and hopefully that is relaxing to you. So, Kiplyn Davis, I still and probably always will be able to picture her in my mind. Again, I did not know her personally, but the pictures that were always around town of cute Kiplyn, she had this curly red hair and just like that all-American girl smile. She just was a darling girl. She was 15 years old, and she was a sophomore at Spanish Fork High School. The morning of May 2nd, 1995, Kiplyn's alarm clock went off at 4:30 a.m. She got up every morning at 4:30 a.m. to get ready because she had a early morning driver's ed class that she went to. She really enjoyed it. It was worth getting up that early for her. She was super excited to get her driver's license. So this particular morning was a drizzly, rainy May morning in Utah. And I imagine the rain kind of like lulled her back to sleep. She kept snoozing her alarm and falling back to sleep. And around 5 a.m., her dad, Richard, came in and was like, "Kiplyn, what are you doing? You have to get up. We have to go. It's time for you to go to driver's ed." Kiplyn was your typical 15-year-old girl. She woke up and became pretty upset that she had slept through her alarm. It was now time for her to go to school. She didn't have time to do her hair, put her makeup on. So she started kind of arguing with her parents, saying, just let me skip today. It's just one class. It's not a big deal. I'm up. I'll get ready, put my makeup on, and then go to school. But her dad was like, "No, you need to go. Every class is important." So they kind of argued, and she got up and quickly got ready for school. Her mom was outside in the car waiting to take her to school, and she was kind of crying and upset. But by the time her mom dropped her off at school, she seemed okay. Like she wasn't as upset anymore, and her mom gave her some lunch money and dropped her off at school. So that afternoon, her dad came home from work about 3:30, and Kiplyn was always home from school when he got home from work. So he was like, that's weird. Usually, it was 1995. They did have cell phones back then. Usually, she would call her parents if there was a change in plans. But he's like, well, maybe she'll turn up soon. So he goes into the kitchen and checks all of the messages on the answering machine. and there is a message on the answering machine from Kiplyn's school saying she never went to her 4th or 5th period classes for the day. So she missed those last 2 classes. So then her dad is a little concerned because that is not typical Kiplyn behavior at all. He's wondering if maybe she was more upset this morning than he realized, and she's kind of blowing off steam and being rebellious by skipping classes. It's not typical of her, but teenage girls sometimes can get around their friends and start telling them what happened and kind of relive the moment over and over again and get more and more upset. So he's thinking maybe that's what happened. So he calls his wife to see if his wife has heard from Kiplyn, and she has not. So he decides to drive over to the high school to see if Kiplyn is there. Now, Kiplyn was very involved in drama. At the drama club, she was often after school helping with production, practicing lines, just kind of hanging out in the auditorium with the drama kids. So he gets in his car and drives to the school thinking maybe he'll find Kiplyn there. By this time, it's about 5 p.m., and the parents are getting pretty concerned that they haven't heard from her. So he drives to the school, and the school's open. He walks through every hallway, the classrooms, looks in the auditorium, and there's no sign of Kiplyn. So he decides to drive to the local church to see if maybe Kiplyn was there. The Davis family are Mormon, and they have a lot of activities for the youth of the Mormon church. Kiplyn was very involved in those as well, so they thought perhaps she was at the church and just not telling her parents where she was because she was angry with them. So he drives to the church, and Kiplyn is not there. So at this point, Richard Davis is getting pretty worried. Nobody seems to know where his daughter is. He certainly doesn't. So he goes home and starts calling all of her friends and asking them if they know where she is, if they've seen her, when the last time they saw her was. And all of her friends that she normally hangs out with, that she's close with, none of them know anything. In fact, none of them remember seeing Kiplyn after school. Lunchtime was the last time that most people remember seeing her. So the parents are pretty unsettled at this point. None of the friends know where she is. Nobody's seen her since lunchtime. So at this point, her mother, Tamara, is home from work, and they go back to the school. It's around 8 o'clock to see if she's there. And when they get to the school's locked up. So they try all the doors. There's a couple cars in the parking lot, which is pretty usual. Kids go home with other kids and come back and get their cars later, or teachers are staying after late. But the school's locked and they don't see anybody. So they go home and they continue calling friends and family to see if anybody has heard from Kiplyn. When they have no luck finding Kiplyn through friends or finding any information really about where Kiplyn would be, they call the police. But after hearing about the argument with the parents in the morning, the police assume that she's probably just run away from home to prove a point, and they just assume she'll be back anytime. Her parents don't think that she's a runaway at all, but there's not much they can do. They can't get the police to look into it any further. So they again return to making phone calls to Kiplyn's friends. And they happen to get a hold of one of her really good friends named Eli. And Eli says that he saw her at lunch at school that day, and she was with a boy named Chris Jepson. Chris Jepson was also involved in drama, and the last time that Eli had seen Kiplyn, she was with him. So Spanish Fork is a very small town, and the family knows where Chris Jepson lives. So her parents drive over to his house. This is about 10 o'clock now, maybe 9:30, and they knock on the door, and the only person that's home is Chris Jepson's sister. And she says she hasn't seen him, she has no idea where he is, but she assumes he's at the school because he did a lot of behind-the-scenes work for the drama club, hanging up curtains, getting the lights ready, all of that type of backstage stuff. So the parents go home, and on their way home, they drive past the school one more time, and there's no cars in the parking lot that they notice. At this point, Kiplyn's parents are just sick about it. They don't know where their daughter is. Nobody knows where their daughter is. There hasn't been any information at all. Nobody's heard from her, not even her friends. So they decide to just drive around to see if they can see her, see if they can find her. So they drive around Spanish Fork for a few hours, and they don't see anything. And on their way back home, they drive by Chris Jepson's house again. There is a truck parked out front that they recognize as another boy, a student from Spanish Fork High School named Rucker Leifson. Rucker had actually asked Kiplyn out previously, but in the Mormon culture, you are not allowed to date until you are 16 years old. So Kiplyn was not allowed to go on a date with him. Her parents go home and start searching through her room, trying to find any information about where she could be, and they find her journal. And in her journal, there is an entry from a few days earlier that talks about how she had a really big crush on Chris Jepson, and how they had actually been kissing and holding hands and stuff like that. Her parents really want to go back to the Jepson home to see if Kiplyn's there, but by this point it's like after 10, and they just feel like it's rude to go knock on somebody's door that late. So they go home and they just hope that Kiplyn will come to her senses and come home. The next morning, Kiplyn is not in her bed. She doesn't show up to school, and people are really starting to worry now. The resource officer who is assigned to Spanish Fork High School becomes aware of the situation and goes through every single classroom talking to the kids, telling them how important it is to come forward if they have any information. He's like, if you've heard something, if you saw something, if there's a rumor of something, we need to know about it because we need to find Kiplyn. So he spends all day going through the classes, but nobody's really saying anything. So he questions Chris Jepson, because at this point Chris Jepson is the last person known to have been with Kiplyn Davis before she disappeared. And Chris Jepson says that he was at the school all night with his friends. He said they were working on a drama production and they had a football. They were kind of throwing the football around in the auditorium. Because he often kept weird hours at the school with his position with the drama committee, he had a key to the school. So he and his friends say they were locked in, they had like locked themselves in the school so people couldn't come in, and they just kind of hung out there pretty late, and then they all went home. And none of them had seen Kiplyn. While they were questioning Chris, he was very open with them. He didn't seem nervous. He didn't seem like he had anything to hide. At this point, police don't have too much to go on. So they decide they're going to start digging a little bit and see what they can find. So they discover another person of interest in the case, another boy who was a student at Spanish Fork High School named Brandon. He had actually asked Kiplyn out that day. And while Kiplyn technically was not allowed to date, she had said yes. And then he had come up to her later and said, "Hey, I've also been seeing this other girl, and she found out that I asked you out and she's furious. I have to cancel our date. We can't go on a date." So they talk to Brandon and he says, "Yes, I asked her out. This happened. I felt so bad that I tried to look for her at lunch to apologize to her. And I couldn't find her anywhere. So I actually left campus to look for her. And I never did find her, but I got a flat tire. And I had to call my friends, and they came and helped me change the tire. And by the time that was done, school was over." So police are like, okay. And they look into his story, but his friends that he claimed came and helped him change the tire said that wasn't true. They didn't help him change a tire. They didn't even see him that afternoon. But at this point, all police have to go on is a girl who is missing, who could be a runaway. There's no evidence of foul play, nothing, just like her parents' hunch that she wouldn't have ran away. So weeks are going by and nobody has heard from Kiplyn. Reports start coming in of sightings of Kiplyn. There were people who said they saw her on Main Street the day she disappeared. There was even a student who came forward and said that he saw Kiplyn after 4th and 5th period, which would mean she had actually come back to the school. That student later came forward and said that that didn't happen. A search of Kiplyn's locker revealed everything was still in it. Her purse, her makeup, her house keys. It really did seem to show that she was planning on coming back. Had she run away, she probably would have taken those personal items, her wallet, that type of thing. Months go by and Kiplyn's just gone. Police began to suspect foul play when rumors start going around the school that Kiplyn was sexually assaulted and murdered and buried in the nearby Spanish Fork Canyon. But everybody just says it's a rumor they heard from another person, and they can never quite figure out where those rumors started from. So police really start looking into Chris Jepson and his 2 friends that he was with the night Kiplyn disappeared, Rucker Leifson and Tim Olson. They question the boys several times, but they always stick to their story that they were all together and they were at the school. Police still have no evidence of a crime. While Kiplyn could still technically be a runaway. People are just thinking more and more that there is foul play. Then, about a year after Kiplyn goes missing, one day, Chris Jepson shows up at Kiplyn's house to talk to her dad. And he says he has something he needs to get off his chest. And Kiplyn's dad is like thinking he's going to confess, he's going to tell us what happened to Kiplyn, where she is. But instead, he just says, I had nothing to do with Kiplyn's disappearance. And the dad kind of freaks out and starts yelling and is like, why are you here? You know something. You wouldn't just come here to say that. And he gets scared and like runs away and leaves. So Kiplyn's dad calls police and tells the police about this weird encounter that has happened with Chris Jepson. And police agree that like that's not something an innocent person would do. So they bring all 3 boys back to talk to them and polygraph them. And while they're talking to one of the boys named Tim Olson, he actually changes his story. And he claims that he went to Spanish Fork Canyon with Kiplyn and Rucker. And Rucker and Kiplyn kind of went off on their own. He kind of let them, gave them some privacy. And then about 45 minutes later, Rucker came back without Kiplyn. The police are so excited, like this is the break they've needed. So they start pushing Tim on information about that day, and he totally freezes up. He recants everything he has just said and says no. He goes back to his original story that he and his 2 friends were at the school in the auditorium the night that Kiplyn went missing. So police are like, well, we're going to use this information for the polygraph test, because they hadn't polygraphed the boys yet at this point. And they're going to start asking him questions about what Tim had just told authorities to try and catch them in a lie on their polygraph test. But miraculously, all 3 boys passed their polygraph tests with flying colors. And we know now that polygraph tests are not that accurate, but they really couldn't do anything. They just let the boys go. They still had no evidence, but they began to really watch the boys closely. So years go by and nothing. No body is ever found. No new evidence comes up. And the poor Davis family, like at this point, they just want closure. They want to know what happened, and they just have nothing. So these boys all, grow up, graduate. They're all married with children. And the Davis family, kind of in like a last-ditch effort to get some answers, decides that they're going to start trying to gather evidence and pushing authorities to gather evidence so that they can have like a grand jury look at all of the information they do have. So they're successful, and the case is kind of reopened. It's back in the public. It's on the news all the time. And people just start coming forward like crazy. 2 people who were at a party with Tim Olson said that one time they were at this party and a little news segment came on the TV about Kiplyn, and he got super mad and said she got what she deserved. And even Chris's wife came forward to say that they were watching a movie one night, So I Married an Axe Murderer, and she jokingly turned to him and said, hey, what's the worst thing you've ever done? And he looked her dead in the eyes and said, what if I told you that I murdered Kiplyn Davis? And like her face must have just shown like so much shock. Of course, if your husband said something like that, and he had always been like known to be involved, that would scare you. But he immediately, like, seeing the look on her face, was like, I'm just kidding. Totally kidding. So she testified to that. Leifson's sister even testified that he was a pathological liar and never told the truth. So people just started coming out of the woodwork to throw these 3 boys under the bus, to talk about their character, to repeat things that had been told to them in the previous years. A lot of these people now, I mean, they're adults, and I think as children in high school, you would never think your friend would do that, and you're trying to, like, have their back by not saying anything. But this is 10 years later, and these people have grown up, and a lot of them have children of their own, and they are seeing this through different eyes. And so the grand jury is just flooded with testimony after testimony of very suspicious behaviors and stories. With all of the information coming out with the grand jury trial, a piece of information that I have no idea how was never checked up on before this point comes out. And this information kind of breaks the case open in the sense that suddenly the 3 boys have no alibi. And the alibi that they've been using for years and years is proven to be false. This information is that the night that Kiplyn went missing, there was a choir production in the auditorium at Spanish Fork High School. Because of that, those boys, the drama club would have had nothing to do in the auditorium that day. It was the choir. They would not have been there late. So suddenly these 3 boys have no alibi. At this point, Kiplyn is missing, presumed dead. They don't have much information. Kiplyn's family has been leaving the front porch light on for 10 years, hoping that one day she'll come home. They left the front porch light on for her that very first night she was missing so she could come home, and they continued to do it. But the more testimony that's coming out about these 3 boys, the more likely it is that Kiplyn is no longer alive. So they decide to have a headstone placed for her at the Spanish Fork Cemetery, and they just still have the hope that they will be able to find her remains and bring her home to rest in Spanish Fork, where she belongs. The judge in the grand jury case believed all 3 boys were lying and withholding evidence that was important to the case. The grand jury felt like they were lying as well and charged all 3 boys with perjury. Tim Olson was sentenced to 12 years in prison for perjury, which is like a crazy amount of time. But because he was the one who had kind of flip-flopped his story, he got the most time. The other boys got 4 and 5 years. So at this point, people are still kind of, little tidbits of information are coming out from people. This is big news in Utah. This is big news in Spanish Fork. People are remembering things from high school. So police feel like they have gathered enough information to charge Tim Olson with the murder of Kiplyn Davis, even without her body. Tim Olson ends up pleading guilty to manslaughter, and he tells police what happened the night that Kiplyn went missing. He says that he and an unnamed other person went up Spanish Fork Canyon with Kiplyn after lunch on May 2nd. And he says that him and this other person, who he will not name, went off into the canyon with Kiplyn to be alone. And after about 45 minutes, he went to find them. And as he found them, he saw this unnamed person with a huge rock in his hand hit Kiplyn in the head, and she fell. And he started freaking out. He was like, "What are you doing? Oh my gosh." And this unnamed person picked up the rock again and hit Kiplyn in the head with it again and said, "Hurry and help me move her body over to the trees." So Tim helped her move the body, helped him move her body over to the trees. And at this point, they didn't know if she was alive, if she was just unconscious, but they were both pretty freaked out. So they got in their car and went back to school. Later that night, they went up to where they had left Kiplyn's body, and it was apparent she was deceased. So they buried her body and went home. Tim Olson refused to name the other person who was involved in Kiplyn's murder. And he would not give a location for her body. Police went up several times with search dogs and tried to uncover her body, but they never did. Chris Jepson pleaded no contest and settled for a lesser crime of obstruction of justice. And Rucker Leifson was never charged for anything that had to do with Kiplyn's disappearance. Most people in the town and Kiplyn's family suspect Rucker was the unnamed person in Tim's story, but they had no evidence, and Tim refused to give that name up. He is still in prison to this day, and he is up for parole in 2021, so in 2 years. And even after all this time in prison, he will still not give up the name of the other person involved in Kiplyn's murder. There are still a lot of questions that have gone unanswered, and Kiplyn's family still doesn't have complete closure. They have a Facebook page in her memory that they still run. They like to keep the word out about it because they're hoping that someday they will be led to the location of her body and be able to bring her home and bury her. And in the meantime, they will leave their front porch light on every single night in hopes that one day they will be able to bring Kiplyn home and bury her and know, and have that closure to kind of know where her body is now. So that is the story of the disappearance of Kiplyn Davis. I really hope you guys enjoyed it.